Hello, my name is Michael Schmidtke, and I'm a fishery scientist with the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council. Today I am presenting on Regulatory Amendment 35 to the Council's Snapper Grouper Fishery Management Plan. The South Atlantic Council is one of 8 regional management councils that were established by Congress through the Magnuson-Stevens Act to manage fisheries in federal waters. The South Atlantic Council's jurisdiction ranges from 3 to 200 miles offshore from the Virginia-North Carolina border through the east coast of the Florida Keys. The Council is made up of recreational and commercial fishermen, state marine agency representatives, and federal representatives. There are 17 members that sit on the Council. 3 members from each of the states in the region and the Southeast Regional Administrator make up the voting members. The Council also includes non-voting members representing other agencies that work with the Council on specific management aspects. The Magnuson-Stevens Act not only established the councils, but also defines their role and requirements for managing federal fisheries. The South Atlantic Council's role is to develop recommendations for laws that would be implemented by NOAA fisheries in its region. Red snapper have been managed under a rebuilding plan since 2011. When first established, this rebuilding plan projected the stock to be rebuilt by 2044. The health of fish populations, or stocks, is evaluated through a process called a stock assessment. In this process, scientists bring together information about species biology, population monitoring led by federal, state, and university scientists, and the commercial and recreational fisheries that interact with that population. Using this information, scientists develop a model that estimates the past and present health of the population and projects how future fishery interactions could affect the population. As part of this process, the maximum sustainable yield, or the largest amount of catch that can be removed from a population on a long-term, year-after-year basis, is estimated. Maximum sustainable yield, or MSY, is a very important number in fisheries management, because the Magnuson-Stevens Act requires that federal fisheries management be based on MSY. First, the Act requires populations be managed so they are producing maximum sustainable yield in a reliable year-to-year fashion. If a population is unable to reliably produce its MSY, it is designated as overfished and a plan is put in place to rebuild the stock to the required production level. If populations are producing MSY, the Act then requires the fisheries have access to harvest what they need from the population as long as they do not remove more than the MSY. If a fishery is removing fish faster than the rate that would remove the MSY, it is designated as experiencing overfishing. The most recent red snapper stock assessment, SEDAR 73, was completed in 2021 and determined that the stock was still overfished and experiencing overfishing, although the stock has shown substantial progress toward rebuilding and is likely to be rebuilt before the original 2044 rebuilding date. After a stock assessment is completed, it is reviewed by a group of state, federal, and university scientists that make up the Council's Scientific and Statistical Committee, or SSC, to determine if the assessment should be used for management. If the SSC determines the assessment should be used, they then recommend future catch levels for that stock. The acceptable biological catch, or ABC, is the greatest annual amount of catch that would not result in overfishing, minus a buffer that accounts for scientific uncertainty and the Council's policy on what probability of overfishing is acceptable for that stock. One of the Council's requirements under the Magnuson-Stevens Act is that they cannot set an annual catch limit that is greater than the SSC's recommended acceptable biological catch. The SSC reviewed SEDAR 73 and developed new recommended catch levels based on the results of that assessment. They did not recommend any scientific uncertainty buffer, so the recommended acceptable biological catch is the same as the overfishing limit in this case. However, the newly recommended ABC is less than the current annual catch limit, so the Council must lower the annual catch limit to be in compliance with federal law. This is addressed in Action 1 of this amendment. There's been quite a bit of concern over the status of red snapper following SEDAR 73. So I want to spend a few slides noting some of the information that was used to develop this status. I will focus on one figure straight out of the assessment report, but the entire report is publicly available on the SEDAR website. This figure shows the estimated numbers of fish in the stock by age over time. The red color at the bottom are your 1-year-olds, then colors transition with age up to the light purple of 20 years and older at the top of each bar. Most of the time, a stock is overfished and not able to reliably produce its maximum sustainable yield because there are too few fish overall. As you can see from the end of this figure, this does not seem to be the case for red snapper. We saw more fish at the end of this time series than have been observed in 40+ years. This is good for the process of rebuilding a depleted stock because one thing you need for a stock to rebuild is increased abundance. So we've seemingly checked that box. Now, why can't a stock with this many fish produce maximum sustainable yield? For that, we need to look within each of these bars. For red snapper, like many other fishes, older females are larger and produce many times more eggs than fish that are much younger. In the public hearing document, we included a table with some comparative numbers, such as it takes about 34 2-year-olds to equal the egg production of one 10-year-old female. As we look at the population over time, we see that today's population has much fewer old fish than in the past. This is important because older females weigh more, so you get more bang for your buck in terms of fish that you're taking home, but also that moves the population biomass closer to the level that would remove that overfished status. Older females, as mentioned previously, also produce many more eggs than younger females. We're talking millions of eggs versus tens or hundreds of millions of eggs. So egg production is much greater in a population with more old, large females. Finally, older females give the population stability in its production and progression of many age classes from one year to the next. Environmental conditions and other factors beyond just the number of spawning fish often play a factor in how many eggs turn into offspring. So when conditions are favorable, you can sometimes see more young fish produced by relatively low levels of egg production coming from younger, smaller females. However, this can make the year-to-year numbers of fish fluctuate up and down really widely rather than having a steady stream of fish moving through from one age and one year to the next. That stability of being very likely to produce enough eggs to reliably make enough young fish and have them grow into old fish to produce MSY year after year is the other component of rebuilding that we haven't yet achieved with this stock, which is why it's still considered overfished. But the hopeful news from the last stock assessment is after some seeming quick increases followed by quick declines, we may now be getting a bit closer to our goal. In this figure, we can think old individuals as being 6 or older, indicated by the light green color, shown about right here, on up to the light purple, shown at certain points throughout the history also by the black lines on the screen. There, and there. I'm noting this age of 6 years old or older because the growth in egg production from 5 years to 6 years is the largest single year change in a red snapper's lifespan. Egg production continues to grow after age 6, just at a slower rate per year. So anything down here at the bottom in the yellow, orange, or red range, those would be our young fish. Now looking at the earliest years in this figure, we see a theoretical age composition for this stock of about 42%. Estimates in these years shown right here are back projected to account for commercial fishing records that go back to the 1950s and to allow the model to see that fish existed in the population and were growing from one age to the next prior to the beginning of age data collection in the late 1970s. In 1980, after we started collecting age data on this population, the percentage of 6 and older fish was estimated at 39%. Because the back projections are most impacted by the oldest data years, we'd expect the theoretical percentage and an early observed percentage to be quite close, and that's what we see. However, as we move into the late 1980s and into the 90s, the number of old individuals really took a hit, and the population crashed. There was a lot of commercial fishing that was going on at that point that was associated with that population decline. At that point, older individuals were a much smaller part of the population, and the size of the population from year to year was likely very dependent on factors other than spawning population size, like environment. Some seemingly favorable conditions happened in the early 2000s, and the population began to increase. However, there was no stability from older, more productive females. They were about 2% of the population. You can see that very small black dot there is about 2% of the population in 2000. So when the favorable conditions went away, the population dropped back down. Then conditions improved and the population popped back up. So these wide swings in population size are quite typical of a population lacking the sustained production of larger females, but that may be experiencing some periods of positive conditions like ocean temperatures becoming suitable for that species over a larger area. That brings us to today, where we've definitely seen some favorable conditions for recruitment and an upswing in the abundance of young fish. In 2019, females comprised about 6% of the population. Now, that may not be 40% like in the 1980s, but it's 3 times more than the 2% or so that we saw during the 2000s as the population was bouncing way up, then way down, then way up, then way down again. So what that means is we have a real chance here with a few more years of growth and progression to really stabilize this production and have the stock rebuilt ahead of schedule. Now to the overfishing status. Fish can be removed from a population by being caught and landed, or by being caught, released, and then dying from that process. A stock is determined to be experiencing overfishing if the rate of removals is greater than the fishing rate that produces the maximum sustainable yield. Overfishing in the long term often results in population decline, so federal law requires the council to end overfishing when it occurs. Most of the time, stocks are determined to experience overfishing due to fish being landed at a greater rate than the rate that would produce MSY. Again, red snapper is a bit of a different situation. Most red snapper that are caught occur out of the season, so they are released and a portion of those die. Due to the high amount of recreational fishing in the South Atlantic region, most of the dead releases are from the recreational sector. Red snapper, as many of you know, are very aggressive and are caught very frequently in our region. So the estimates of dead releases are very high, so much so that even if there were no red snapper landings at all, the removal rate from the dead releases would still be greater than the threshold level and overfishing would still be occurring. This means that the council cannot address overfishing as it's charged to do by federal law by only changing the landings. There must be action to reduce the dead releases. The council has a multi-pronged effort to address dead releases of red snapper. One way it is responding is through regulations and encouraging practices that increase survival of released fish. The council is in the process of expanding its best fishing practices outreach and education efforts through the addition of a full-time staff person and through exploration of innovative ways to communicate best practices to fishermen. The Council is acting to reduce dead releases in this amendment by reducing effective effort. This isn't simply time on the water, but also speaks to the efficiency of practices and gear. Ways to reduce effective effort include avoidance of areas or times of year when certain species of fish are common, or using gear that reduces the rate or overall number of fish caught. In Action 2 of this amendment, the Council is considering a requirement that only one hook be used while snapper grouper fishing recreationally. Because the South Atlantic snapper grouper fishery is made up of many species, fishing effort directed at one species results in effective effort for many species. When someone drops for black sea bass, for example, they could catch a black sea bass, or a red snapper, or a vermilion snapper, or a variety of other species. Therefore, in order to reduce releases of one snapper grouper species, the Council needs to reduce the releases for many of the snapper grouper species that co-occur. Red snapper belong to the multi-species snapper grouper fishery in the South Atlantic region. Many of the species in this fishery have different regulations. So while red snapper is the most extreme example, the issue of dead releases affects species throughout the snapper grouper fishery to varying levels and can have impacts on the number of fish that are allowed to be landed. When stock assessments are run, they look at past levels of catch and release, consider any recent changes to management, then they predict future levels of dead releases. So a chunk of the allowable removals for a stock, for example, that MSY value that I talked about earlier and any buffers that are built off of that, a chunk of that is taken out such that the more predicted dead releases, the fewer fish can be kept and landed. I included a couple examples here to illustrate this. First, red snapper. Its assessment estimated that 230,000 fish could be sustainably removed from the population in 2023. However, it also projects that about 900,000 fish would be caught and released, and 23% of those, or about 202,000 fish, would die and be removed from the population by that process, which leaves 28,000 fish to be removed as landings. For the most recent gag grouper assessment, you see much fewer releases projected, but a similar type of thing, still 10% of the removals are not available to be landed because of catch and release mortality. These levels vary from stock to stock, but these are a couple of the many examples of snapper grouper species for which there could be more landings if we reduce the dead releases in this fishery overall. Regulatory Amendment 35 has been put on a tight time frame to make sure the Council is meeting its federal requirement to set catch levels according to the SSC's recommendations. However, the Council has many other projects also happening right now and planned in the future to fully address the overfishing of red snapper, reduce dead releases in the snapper grouper fishery, and to improve the system for managing snapper grouper species as a whole. The first one I want to highlight is our expansion of the Council's Best Fishing Practices Outreach and Education Program. We will be adding actually a new full-time staff person that will be dedicated to improving the compliance with best fishing practices in this region. The Snapper Grouper Management Strategy Evaluation is a simulation study that will be conducted, is going on right now and will be conducted throughout the course of this year and next year. And in this simulation study, we can see whether and how snapper grouper populations could be affected by changes to management. Some suggestions we've heard throughout this hearing process that could be explored in this study include a maximum size or slot limit, a multi-species bag limit, or changes in the timing of the red snapper open season. Amendment 46 considers the establishment of a federal recreational snapper grouper permit, and this we're hoping will really improve the estimates of recreational catch for this region. Next, we have the estimation of U.S. Atlantic red snapper abundance, informally known as the South Atlantic red snapper count. This is a similar project to the Gulf red snapper count that was conducted in the Gulf of Mexico a few years ago, and we're hoping that this will improve the estimates of abundance of red snapper within the region. The next red snapper stock assessment has been scheduled as well. This begins with a research track assessment to develop the best model for the available data, and in that process we'll be incorporating the information from the South Atlantic red snapper count. That'll then be followed by an operational assessment, which is used to estimate new catch levels for the fishery. And finally, there are a variety of other scientific and research projects going on in the region, some of them being conducted by Council staff, some being conducted by the Southeast Fisheries Science Center, and these are looking at many different aspects of the fishery. A few examples include comparisons of recreational gear efficiencies, how management changes would affect a multi-species fishery like we see in the South Atlantic Snapper Grouper Fishery, and then finally improvements in a study on on spatial abundance using fishery independent data. So although Regulatory Amendment 35 is primarily geared to make the Council compliant with Magnuson-Stevens Act requirements, the Council is working in a wide variety of ways toward improving snapper grouper management and red snapper management. And most of these ways will be coming actually back out to you, to the public, for additional input along the way later this year. So now on to the specifics of Regulatory Amendment 35. There are two changes that are being proposed. First is to reduce the catch levels based on the most recent stock assessment and SSC recommendation. The second change that's proposed is to prohibit the use of more than one hook per line while recreationally fishing for snapper grouper species. Regulatory Amendment 35 has been under development for about a year now, so we're towards the end stages of that development process. This amendment will be considered for final approval by the Council at their March 2023 meeting in Jekyll Island, Georgia. The changes in management are expected to be implemented in mid to late 2023. Depending on how long the federal rulemaking process takes after the Council considers their approval in March, that would be the determining factor on whether this will affect the July 2023 season. So at this point, it's unclear whether the results of this amendment would affect the July 2023 red snapper season. Action 1 considers a reduction of the acceptable biological catch according to the SSC's recommendation, also a reduction to the total annual catch limit, the sector annual catch limits, and the annual optimum yield for South Atlantic red snapper. At this time, the Council is not considering any changes to the allocation for red snapper. About 70% of the total ACL is allocated to the recreational sector, and about 30% is allocated to the commercial sector. One thing I want to note on this slide as you're looking at the current levels for the fishery is that this difference in units, the commercial fishery is monitored in pounds whole weight, which is why we show the number in that unit, versus the recreational fishery, which is monitored in numbers of fish. And so we show the corresponding units according to what those sectors are monitored in. But if you were to convert this 124,815 number, divide that by the average weight of commercial fish that we get from the commercial logbooks, then you would get the remaining number of 42,510 minus 29,656 in terms of the number of fish. The Council has selected a preferred alternative for Action 1, that is Preferred Alternative 2, that would set the total annual catch limit and annual optimum yield to be equal to the recommended acceptable biological catch values. And you can see how those numbers are set equal here and how those break down into the commercial annual catch limit and the recreational annual catch limit for the next several years. In terms of the recreational fishery, I know we normally think of this in terms of the number of days. The projections that are indicated here with these limits would be about a 2-day season for the recreational fishery. There is a third alternative that is included in this action for consideration. It is not the Council's preferred, but it would set a 0 fish total ACL. That would mean a closure for the entire year for both sectors, commercial and recreational. Neither sector would be able to catch and retain red snapper. Action 2 considers a prohibition of the use of more than one hook per line for the snapper grouper recreational sector. The reason why this action is being considered is to address overfishing of red snapper by reducing dead releases of snapper grouper species. And the recreational sector is specifically included in this action because most of the dead releases that occur for red snapper occur from the recreational sector. We already actually have hook-related regulations in this region. So alternative 1 shows our current hook regulations north of 28 degrees north latitude. Fishermen are required to use a non-offset, non-stainless steel circle hook when fishing for snapper grouper species with hook and line and natural bait. Right now they can use multiple hooks, but that's the type of hook that they have to use. South of 28 latitude, non-stainless steel hooks are required when fishing for snapper grouper using hook and line and natural bait. Alternative 2 under Action 2 proposes limiting the same types of hooks, but just limiting them to only one hook can be used per line for the recreational fishery. So this notes that the commercial regulations are not being considered to change. The commercial fishery for the hook and line component is still required to use the circle hooks where necessary or the non-stainless steel hooks where necessary, but they would not be prohibited from multiple hooks by this regulation change. Only the recreational fishery would be changed and they would be required to use a one hook rig. Here we're just highlighting some common rigs that are used in the snapper grouper fishery to note some of these would still be allowed under Alternative 2 versus others that would not be. So some examples of one hook rigs that would still be allowed under Alternative 2 would be your Carolina rig, your three-way swivel rig, your knocker rig. What would be prohibited, an example of that under Alternative 2 would be your multi-hook chicken rig. It's been mentioned within some of the hearings that single hook chicken rigs exist if you want to use the smaller hooks to go after some of the smaller species in the snapper grouper complex like triggerfish. You just would not be able to use the multi-hook setup. You would need to use a single hook setup. That concludes the information that we're going to be presenting about Regulatory Amendment 35. So as you think about what you would like to comment on, just posing some discussion questions for your consideration. Which alternatives should the council select under each of the two actions that are being considered? What other changes besides those that are being considered in this amendment and other amendments that were noted in previous slides, what other changes would you recommend to improve the management of red snapper and the snapper grouper fishery as a whole here in the South Atlantic region? The council has opened up a variety of different ways that comments can be submitted related to this regulatory amendment. There were 6 in-person public hearings held. A webinar hearing will be held on January 31st. You can also submit comments using our written formats. We have an online comment tool that you can find on the council website. You can also submit your comments via postal mail or via fax using the information shown on this slide. If you have general questions or are looking for information about the council, feel free to check out our website, safmc.net, or you can contact our public information officer, Kim Iverson. She can typically direct you wherever you need to go. If you have questions or want more information on Regulatory Amendment 35 or the Snapper Grouper Fishery Management Plan, feel free to contact me using the information shown on the screen. Thank you for attending this presentation from the South Atlantic Council.